Our mission, if you like, for this deep dive is to try and understand what was really driving European exploration back then.
Yeah, and how it started shaping this Atlantic world, the interactions, the consequences for everyone involved.
And, looking at some of those early illustrations, like the one showing Columbus landing,
Mm-hmm.
you see King Ferdinand standing right there pointing. It really hits you with it. This wasn't just about lone explorers, was it?
No, definitely not. It makes you ask, what were the bigger forces, the systems pushing all this?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's start unpacking that. Portugal seems like the place to begin, right? Even before Columbus.
Absolutely. In the 1400s, you've got Prince Henry the Navigator really pushing Portuguese exploration down the African coast and out into the Atlantic.
And they weren't just sailing past. They set up these island colonies, the Canaries, Cape Verde, Azores, Madeira.
Strategic spots.
Very strategic. They functioned as crucial trade outposts, stepping stones, really.
Which let them push further, didn't it?
Yeah.
Down Africa's west coast, eventually to India, even Brazil.
Right. And their goal wasn't always about controlling huge land masses inland. It was more about dominating the sea routes.
Holding key ports, strategic islands, controlling the trade lanes.
Precisely. And their interactions in West Africa, well, that exposed them to existing trade networks.
Including the trade in enslaved people.
Yes. And when they saw the potential for growing sugar on those Atlantic islands, well, that changed things.
Sugar needed labor, lots of it.
And so they began transporting enslaved Africans to work those plantations. Sugar quickly became maybe the major driver of the early transatlantic slave trade. We should probably mention Elmina Castle, too. Built by the Portuguese, where Ghana is now, back in 1482.
A really important and grim example. Initially, it was all about gold, a trading post for gold.
But that shifted.
Drastically.
Yeah.
By the 1500s, its main purpose changed. Those dungeons weren't for storing goods anymore.
They became holding pens for people.
For enslaved Africans, waiting for that horrific journey across the Atlantic, while the traders lived upstairs. It's a stark picture of that shift, from gold to human lives as the primary commodity.
Driven by the demand for labor, especially for sugar.
The economics just flipped. Enslaved people became more valuable to their enterprise than gold.
So while Portugal's building the sea-based empire, Spain's watching, right, and wanting in on the action.
Oh, definitely. They were looking for an edge, especially in the 15th century.
Mm-hmm.
The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella in 1469 was huge.
Unifying Catholic Spain, laying the groundwork.
It consolidated their power internally. And you have to connect that to the Reconquista, the push to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule.
Which they completed in 1492, the same year Columbus sailed.
Exactly. That victory, that centuries-long effort, it created this strong sense of, religious mission combined with national consolidation.
So now they could look outwards, expand Catholicism, find new trade routes, compete with Portugal.
Which brings us neatly to Christopher Columbus, an Italian, interestingly enough.
And he couldn't get anyone to fund his idea at first, right? Got turned down multiple times, even by Ferdinand and Isabella initially.
Right. His idea of sailing west to get to India. Most experts thought his math was way off about the size of the Earth.
But timing is everything, I guess, after the Reconquista finished in 1492.
Suddenly, Ferdinand and Isabella had the resources and maybe the political will to take a gamble. Portugal was making progress going east. Maybe this westward route was Spain's shortcut.
So they funded him, Nina, Pinta, Santa Maria, 1492.
And off he went. He hits land in the Bahamas October 12th, explores Hispaniola.
And genuinely believes he's reached the East Indies.
Which is why he calls the native Taino people Indios. Indians. A name that obviously stuck, with massive consequences.
When he gets back to Spain, it's not just a pat on the back, is it?
Not at all. He gets titles.
Mm-hmm.
Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Governor, Viceroy. Big stuff.
And there's that agreement, too. Part of the wealth goes towards fighting Islam.
Yes, that intertwining of God and gold, or God and mammon, it's a constant theme. Religion and economics, hand in hand.
His 1493 letter, the Probanza de Merito, that really stirred things up in Europe.
It did. The proofs of merit were basically reports back to the crown, designed to get more funding, more support.
But we have to be careful with them as sources, right? They're biased.
Extremely biased. These guys were writing to impress the king and queen, justify what they were doing, make themselves look good. They're shaping a narrative.
Selling the whole enterprise, painting a picture of the Americas as ripe for the picking.
Right. You read Columbus's letter to Luis de Santangelo. He's raving about the harbors, the rivers, the fertile land, trees, fruit, birds, honey, hints of metals, lots of people.
But crucially,
He also emphasizes what they don't seem to have. Iron, steel, weapons. And he describes the people as timid.
That's the narrative he's building. Abundant resources, easily controlled people, perfect for Spain's goals, wealth, land, maybe easy conquest.
And this, of course, immediately sparks that rivalry with Portugal again.
Because Portugal says, hang on, based on earlier agreements with the Pope, these lands are ours.
Right, which leads to a diplomatic scramble. Pope Alexander VI, who happened to be Spanish, issues these papal bulls in 1493, mostly favoring Spain.
But Portugal pushed back.
They did, which led to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, a line drawn down the map.
Spain gets the lands west of the line, Portugal gets the east.
Which is why Brazil ends up Portuguese. But think about what that treaty means. Two European powers just carving up the world between themselves.
With zero regard for the people already living there.
None whatsoever. It sets this precedent for unilateral claims, ignoring sovereignty. And Columbus's voyages, well, they just opened the floodgates. More Spanish explorers, conquistadors pouring across the Atlantic, driven by these stories of gold and compliant natives.
Think of Hernan Cortés. He wasn't just some adventurer. He wanted titles, tribute, a pension, real tangible rewards.
He lands in Hispaniola, explores the Yucatan, and then famously arrives in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in 1519.
And the Spanish accounts show this mixture of, well, amazement and horror.
Amazed by the city, the causeways, gardens, temples, it was sophisticated.
Definitely. But horrified by the Aztec practice of human sacrifice. And above all, obsessed with the gold.
So much gold.
That obsession leads directly to Cortés taking the emperor, Moctezuma, hostage, and then the massacre during the festival.
Which causes this massive Aztec uprising. The Spanish barely escaped Tenochtitlan.
But Cortés was clever. He starts making alliances with other indigenous groups.
People who already resented Aztec rule.
Exactly, like the Tlaxcalans. They provided thousands of warriors. It's crucial to remember the conquest wasn't just Spaniards versus Aztecs. It was far more complex, involving native alliances. And after this long, brutal siege, nearly a year, Tenochtitlan falls in August 1521.
But we absolutely have to mention disease here, smallpox.
Brought unintentionally by the Europeans.
And it just decimated the population of Tenochtitlan. They had no immunity. It was a huge factor in the city's fall.
And then there's the figure of Malintzin, La Malinche.
Doña Marina, as the Spanish called her. Incredibly complex figure. Her language skills were indispensable to Cortés. Translator, negotiator.
But seen by many later as a traitor, others see her as a victim caught in the middle.
Her story really highlights the tangled, often tragic roles indigenous individuals played in the conquest itself.
And the search for wealth just kept going. Francisco Pizarro, he sets his sights on the Inca Empire in South America.
Heard rumors of even greater riches. He captures and executes the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in the early 1530s. Founds Lima.
But like Cortés, Pizarro also gets caught up in infighting amongst the Spanish, right? Gets assassinated eventually.
Yes, these conquests were incredibly violent, not just towards the indigenous people, but also among the conquistadors themselves. Then you have others pushing further afield.
Hernando de Soto, tramping through the southeastern U.S. looking for gold.
From 1539 to 1542, finds no great empires or gold, but spreads European diseases with devastating effect. He dies out there himself.
And Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, searching for the mythical city of gold, Quivira, in the southwest.
Same story, 1540 to 1542. Clashes with native peoples like the Tiwa, finds no gold city, returns bankrupt.
So these grand expeditions often ended in failure for the leaders, but the impact.
The impact back in Europe, especially from the silver and gold that was found, particularly later in places like Peru and Mexico, was immense. It helped fuel Spain's golden age.
The Siglo de Oro. A cultural boom.
Huge flourishing of arts and literature under the Habsburgs. You get Cervantes writing Don Quixote.
A foundational piece of Western literature.
And amazing painters. Innovative foreigners like El Greco drawn to Spain, plus native geniuses like Diego Velázquez. Think of Las Meninas. Just incredible work.
Okay, so while all this exploration and conquest is happening, there's another huge change brewing back in Europe. Religion.
A massive one. Up till the 1500s, the Catholic Church was more or less the unifying religious force across Western Europe.
But then comes the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, 1517, John Calvin a bit later.
They challenged the Church's authority, its doctrines, its practices, and it leads to this fundamental split in Christianity.
Protestantism spreads, especially in Northern Europe. And Catholic powers, especially Spain, see this as a major threat.
A threat to their religion, but also to their political power. They try hard to stamp it out.
And this religious conflict spills over into the Atlantic world, doesn't it? Competition for land gets tied up with competition for souls.
Absolutely. Martin Luther's initial complaints seem quite specific now, selling indulgences, church taxes on Germans, Mass being in Latin so nobody could understand it.
He posts his 95 Theses, wants the Bible in everyday language, criticizes the Pope's power.
And unintentionally, really, he sparks this massive break. Lutheranism takes hold.
Then John Calvin pushes things further, emphasis on scripture, predestination.
Establishes that Bible commonwealth in Geneva. Calvinism spreads to places like the Netherlands, Scotland.
And England takes its own path, starts Catholic.
Strongly Catholic. But Henry VIII wants a male heir. The Pope won't grant him an annulment.
So in the 1530s, he just breaks away, declares himself head of the Church of England.
Which kicks off decades of religious back and forth. His son Edward is Protestant. His daughter Mary tries to restore Catholicism, hence Bloody Mary.
And then Elizabeth I lands on a sort of middle ground, Protestant Church of England, but keeps some Catholic rituals.
Each wasn't enough for everyone. Groups like the Puritans emerge. They want to purify the church, get rid of all the Catholic leftovers.
And that desire for religious freedom, their specific kind of freedom, is what pushes many of them to North America later, right?
Exactly. The migrations in the 1620s and 30s to New England. They wanted to build their ideal Protestant society away from English corruption.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, this rise of Protestantism is a huge problem for Spain.
A massive challenge to their Catholic empire. They pour resources into fighting it, but they can't stop it everywhere.
Like in the Netherlands, the Dutch fight a long war for independence from Spain.
And the Dutch Republic, established in 1581, becomes known for a degree of religious tolerance, certainly compared to Spain.
Which leads to King Philip of Spain's big gamble, the Spanish Armada in 1588, to crush England and the Dutch.
And it fails spectacularly, defeated by the English Navy and bad weather. A huge symbolic blow to Spain.
Though the fighting didn't stop there, there was this undeclared war between England and Spain for years.
Right into the early 17th century. But that Armada defeat really signaled a shift. England and the Dutch Republic were now serious challengers to Spain in the Atlantic.
Spain still holds on to its massive American empire, but
by the early 1600s, they can't stop the English, the French, the Dutch from planting their own flags, especially on those smaller Caribbean islands.
And it was a time of intense religious intolerance generally, wasn't it? State religions cracking down, things like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France.
A brutal reminder of how intertwined religion and violence were in this period.
Okay, so as we move into the 17th century, Spain's dominance is definitely being challenged. What's driving these other European powers?
Well, the lure of wealth is still huge. Gold, silver, sure, but also furs, timber, other resources. The Americas look like a land of opportunity.
And it becomes this new stage for old rivalries, plus the religious angle planting Protestantism or expanding Catholicism.
England, as we said, was a bit slow off the mark initially. Internal issues, less money than Spain early on.
Henry VII sent John Cabot way back in 1497, and English fishing boats knew the North American coast.
But sustained colonization efforts really took off later. Their first major colonial focus was actually closer to home, Ireland.
Under Queen Elizabeth I, though, things change. She starts backing Atlantic ventures, partly to stick it to Spain.
Definitely. She authorized privateers, essentially legal pirates like Francis Drake, to raid Spanish ships and towns, hit them where it hurts their treasure fleets.
She also backed early colonization attempts, like Roanoke, Sir Walter Raleigh's venture.
Right, in the 1580s, which famously failed. The lost colony. We still don't know exactly what happened there. Croatoan.
A reminder that colonization was risky, difficult stuff.
Very much so. But the promoters kept pushing. They stressed the potential profits, but also the religious duty established Protestantism, counter-Catholic Spain.
Which leads to new ways of funding these ventures. Joint stock companies.
Like the Virginia Company. Investors pool their money, share the risk, hope for big returns. It's a way to finance these expensive, uncertain expeditions.
And the Virginia Company founds Jamestown in 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America.
Permanent, yes, but barely. Those early years were incredibly rough. Disease, starvation, conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy. George Percy's accounts paint a grim picture.
But it survived, and it became the foothold. English colonization starts picking up speed after that. Bermuda, Caribbean islands.
St. Christopher, Barbados, Nevis, Montserrat, Antigua. These smaller islands become really important.
Especially for cash crops. Tobacco initially, then sugar.
Sugar transforms Barbados. It becomes maybe the most profitable English colony for a time, entirely built on sugar and enslaved African labor. A brutal but influential model.
And at the same time, you have the Puritans heading to New England for religious reasons.
Right. The Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620, separatists who wanted a complete break from the Church of England. Their Mayflower Compact is famous as an early form of self-government.
Then the bigger group, the Puritans who founded Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, they wanted to reform the church, not totally separate, but build their ideal community.
So by the early mid-17th century, England's presence is growing, but it's still quite different from Spain's empire. Less centralized, maybe less immediately wealthy, but diverse.
Commercial colonies in the South and Caribbean, religious ones in the North.
Meanwhile, France is also getting more involved, also Catholic, also interested in resources and expansion.
Jacques Cartier had claimed New France, Canada back in the 1500s, but permanent settlement came later.
Samuel de Champlain is the key figure there. Founds Quebec in 1608. Critically, he builds relationships with native groups, the Huron, the Algonquins, alliances against the Iroquois.
And the French focus was heavily on
furs. The fur trade becomes the economic engine of New France. They establish trading posts, networks deep into the continent, rather than large agricultural settlements initially.
Though they also colonized Caribbean islands later, like Guadeloupe and Martinique, for sugar, following that same pattern.
Yes, the Caribbean sugar boom drew everyone in eventually, and then there are the Dutch.
Their story is tied up with that fight for independence from Spain.
Absolutely. The Dutch Republic emerges from that long war, fueled by Calvinism and commerce. They become a major maritime and financial power in the 17th century.
And they use these powerful corporations, right? The Dutch East India Company, the Dutch West India Company.
These companies were almost like states unto themselves with huge resources and authority to trade, colonize, even wage war.
Henry Hudson, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, explores the river that now bears his name in 1609.
Which leads to the Dutch claim on New Netherland. Again, initially focused on the fur trade run by the Dutch West India Company.
They set up New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island as their main hub, trading posts like Fort Orange upriver near modern Albany.
Doing a brisk trade with the Algonquian and Iroquois peoples. And like everyone else, they also grabbed colonies in the Caribbean, Aruba, Curacao, etc.
So by the mid-1600s, the Dutch are serious commercial rivals to Spain. Amsterdam is a global trade center.
You really see the Atlantic becoming this crowded, competitive space.
Yeah, the promoters back in Europe are talking up the wealth, the glory. But the reality on the ground is often about sheer survival and finding labor.
A constant, desperate need for labor. And that tension between freedom for the colonizers and the brutal exploitation of others, it's fundamental.
And this is where we really need to talk about the Columbian Exchange.
This massive transfer of plants, animals, diseases, back and forth across the Atlantic, it changes everything.
But first, that labor problem. How did the Spanish initially solve it?
Through the encomienda system, the crown granted conquistadors the right to demand labor and tribute from specific native communities.
In theory, the Spanish were supposed to protect them and convert them to Catholicism in return.
In theory. In practice, it was often just brutal exploitation. Natives resisted the forced labor, resisted conversion.
And the Spanish response was often violent.
Extremely violent, which brings us to Bartolomé de las Casas.
He was an encomendero himself at first, wasn't he?
He was. But he had this profound change of heart. Became a Dominican friar and a fierce critic of Spanish cruelty towards the natives.
Denouncing the atrocities, lobbying the king for reforms, like the new laws to end the encomienda and native slavery.
His writings were incredibly influential. They fueled what became known as the Black Legend, this image of the Spanish as uniquely bloodthirsty.
Which Spain's rivals, the English, the Dutch, were happy to use, right? To make their own colonization seem more humane by comparison.
Oh, absolutely. It became a tool of propaganda in those imperial rivalries.
But the labor shortage persisted, and by the mid-1500s, another source of labor becomes dominant.
Enslaved Africans. Transported in huge numbers, primarily for cash crops like sugar and tobacco.
What was the justification Europeans used?
Often it boiled down to religious difference. They weren't Christian. Later, this hardened into racist ideologies about inherent inferiority. It was self-serving justification for horrific exploitation.
The conditions were appalling. Resistance met with extreme violence.
Physical, mental, sexual violence was endemic to the system. Portugal really led the way in the transatlantic slave trade initially. Those factories like Elmina.
Processing and shipping human beings, selling them to Spanish, Dutch, English colonists, mostly to South America and the Caribbean at first.
Especially for sugar. Cultivating sugarcane is backbreaking, dangerous work. Processing it in the mills was just as bad.
Las Casas estimated, 50,000 enslaved people on Hispaniola alone by 1550?
It's staggering. Though it's worth noting, a very small number of Africans came earlier, some even as free men with explorers like Cortez. But the overwhelming story becomes one of chattel slavery.
And all this is happening within an economic framework called mercantilism.
Right. The dominant idea in Europe at the time. Basically, wealth is finite, measured in gold and silver. A nation gets stronger by accumulating more precious metals than its rivals.
And colonies are key to this. They provide the raw materials,
Which the mother country takes, turns into finished goods, and sells back to the colonies or elsewhere. It's a closed system, ideally. No free trade.
Colonies exist to enrich the colonizing nation. Spain's treasure fleets are the perfect example.
Exactly. You need resource-rich colonies, cheap labor, loyal colonists, and control of shipping. That's mercantilism in a nutshell.
And this period sees the rise of commodification in the Americas, too. Things that had local or ritual value.
Like silver or tobacco or even chicha, that Andean corn beer. They get pulled into this global market, assigned a monetary value, traded as commodities,
Reshaping native economies, fueling early capitalism.
and driving that relentless search for more resources, more commodities to sell.
Okay, back to the Columbian Exchange, that two-way street. We've mentioned sugar and tobacco going from the Americas, or adapted there, to Europe and becoming huge.
Sugar was maybe the single most important commodity, like oil today maybe. Drove empires, wars, slavery.
Tobacco, too, becomes globally popular despite initial skepticism.
Europeans even started thinking it had medicinal properties. A truly global commodity by the end of the 1500s.
And chocolate, from the cacao bean, used by Aztecs as currency, drunk unsweetened.
The Spanish found it bitter at first, called it devil's vomit, I think. But they brought it back, added sugar, and it became a luxury item in European courts.
What about animals going the other way, from Europe to the Americas?
Pigs, horses, cows, chickens, huge impact. They often thrived, fewer diseases, fewer predators initially. Horses revolutionized life for many Plains Indians, for example.
And Europeans encountered strange new animals, too, manatees, sloths, reinforcing that sense of a new world.
And interestingly, this encounter with the unknown, things not mentioned in the Bible or classical texts, pushed Europeans towards empiricism, trusting observation over just ancient authority. A slow but major shift.
But the most devastating part of the exchange was invisible microbes, diseases.
Catastrophic. Smallpox, measles, mumps, influenza, diseases that were common in Europe, but Native Americans had zero immunity.
The death rates were unimaginable, wiped out huge percentages of the population in many areas.
They completely destabilized societies, made conquest easier in many cases, unintentionally.
And some native groups interpreted these deaths differently, didn't they?
Yes, especially in Eastern North America. Some saw the mass deaths not as disease, but as spiritual attacks or hostile acts, which led to things like mourning wars.
Groups like the Iroquois raiding enemies to take captives.
To replace the dead, they had rituals of adoption, re-quickening the captives into their families and clans. As disease losses mounted, these mourning wars intensified.
Wow. So wrapping up this deep dive then, we've seen these powerful drivers, wealth, power, religion, pushing Europeans across the Atlantic.
Portugal and Spain get there first, dominate early on, but then England, France, the Dutch challenge that supremacy.
And the Columbian Exchange utterly transforms both sides of the Atlantic economies, diets, landscapes.
But with incredibly brutal consequences, especially for Native Americans decimated by disease, and for the millions of Africans forced into slavery. It's a complex, often dark story.
Hopefully, though, you listening can now see those forces at play, understand the massive shifts that happened in this foundational period.
Absolutely. The world we live in was profoundly shaped by these events.
Which brings us to a final thought for you. How do the legacies of this early globalization still echo today? What connections can you see to modern trade, migration, cultural clashes, or exchanges? Something to ponder.
Indeed.